Historically, the United States has been one of Africa's largest investors, but China's influence on the continent is rising. I met up with Jude to discuss Africa's growth and how Liberia's civil wars impacted his childhood.
Talk to us about how the war impacted you, your family, what it's like to escape a country, go to a refugee camp.
Liberia, unlike most countries in Africa, was never colonized. It's Liberia and Ethiopia. Liberia was founded by free slaves from the US. So the free slaves who returned to Africa, returned to Liberia, sort of replicated some of the same structures they had left here. So indigenous Liberians, people who were met there was no social mobility for them. If you had an indigenous sounding name, you couldn't go forward. And over time, the resentment built up to a point where it exploded into this, there was a coup d'etat, and then following the coup d'etat, there was this long war. And so the way I end up here is, I was about 13 or 14, and there were multiple rebel groups. So there was always fighting for territory. So territory was exchanging hands depending on who was more powerful. And my mom had given birth to a set of twins, and we had to walk probably like 15 or 20 miles to the border, to the Ivorian border, and one of the twins passed away. And I remember them being like 13, 14, and saying to myself, when I grow up, I'm gonna be a big man, because that's in most places in Africa, it's like big man. But when I become a big man, I'm gonna make sure that mothers and their kids do not have to experience this, what we're experiencing now.
You wanted to be that big man.
That's right.
You got the opportunity to be that big man. But talk to me about what it is inside you that chooses to do that. Because I think other young men might say, because my family suffered, I'm going to pick up a weapon. I'm going to make these people pay. You know, there's two pathways you can go.
Yeah, definitely. I think so.
Why do you think you chose the one you did?
So my younger brother, he eventually passed away, but the one after me became a child soldier. And I remember once he'd come over to Cote d'Ivoire, and we walked from where our mother lived to where I went to school. And this is like 15, 13. He's 13, I'm 15. And I asked him, because he was explaining to me a scene from when they went to the war front. And I asked him, if you had died, because he was explaining a colleague died, if that had been you, what would you say you died for? But he's 13 years old. Of course he couldn't answer the question. Today, I feel bad when I think of asking him the question, because he was a kid. There was no way he would have been able to give you any explanation for what he was doing. And so, why do people from the same family, two brothers, make two completely different choices in terms of what to do? I don't know. I think it's just the personal makeup of people or whatever. So, I don't know. But I chose the path that I did, and other kids chose the path that they did. But it could also be I was always a pretty good student. And so I always saw a way out. And, for kids for whom there was actually no other path, this one made the most sense to them. I have no idea what went through their mind in terms of the choices they made. So you can imagine, obviously, at some point during the war, kids went to school as an end in itself, because there was no future. You just went to school so that you had something to do. And so getting out of that and being able to come to the US and go to school has just opened up a whole world of opportunities for pretty fortunate, because not a lot of kids had the opportunity to be able to do that. And so obviously completely changed my life, and I guess that of my family.
His love for education eventually landed Jude at Berea College in the southeastern U.S. state of Kentucky, where he studied political science. He pursued graduate studies at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., before eventually returning to Liberia. He served as Deputy Chief of Staff to Liberian President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf before she appointed him Liberia's Minister of Public Works, overseeing the country's public construction and maintenance projects, just a year out of grad school. Today, he's back in Washington, D.C., where he's a visiting fellow at the Center for Global Development, a nonprofit think tank that focuses on international development. Jude's research looks at the rise of China's financing in Africa.
There are a lot of people who would like to close the door on the relationship between Africa and China. It's a debt trap, the tentacles of China. You hear all of this. You were actually involved in conversations with the Liberian president in China. You've seen these infrastructure projects on the continent. Give me your sense of how it's viewed here in the West. Because as you point out, there's two different lenses. You can see China through the business lens or the government lens, and they are different.
I have a narrative of the China-Africa story, so I can start.
I'd love to hear it. Yeah. I think our viewers would too.
And the way I think about it is like, and so when you go to China, one of the things that they do over and over is everything is like, this is 3,000 years old. This is 5,000 years old. So one of the things that the Chinese harp on, and I think they use this to political advantage too, is China's engagement in Africa begins with the journeys of Zheng He. And that, 1400s, he comes to Africa, he's the first, interacts, they took no slaves, they were respectful to the people, and, this is a benefit to China. Because one of the things in terms of China's promotion of itself on the continent is that it sees itself as a developing country. It has no baggage of colonialism. It doesn't have all of those negative things, and that it understands, what its sister countries or brother countries are going to. But so that's the first interaction in my narrative and my story. But in terms of modern times, it's probably 1955, 56 with the Bandung Conference in Indonesia. China was present when Asian and African countries come together to sort of confirm and affirm their opposition to colonialism in all its forms. But then the next big thing is Tazara, right? The rail between Tanzania and Zambia. And what happens here is very instructive because the Tanzanian and the Zambian government came to Washington, and the World Bank actually did a feasibility study and saw that this rail doesn't make any economic sense. And Mao saw an opening, Chairman Mao saw an opening and said, China would do it. And initially the Africans were skeptical of accepting the Chinese aid because at the time, Chairman Mao was fomenting revolution, and the assumption was that he will foment revolution against you if you allow the Chinese to come in. But at this time, China is really, really poor, and this is over $400 million in 1967, $1970, which is almost $3 billion in today's terms. And they built that. And China makes the argument that as a fellow developing country, I understand what infrastructure means to you, but this is not a wealthy country at the time. And so Zambia probably has the longest relationship between an African country and China. But you have to remember also, throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, HIV/AIDS was ravaging the continent. So it was kind of hard for Western companies and Western businesses to see Africa as a place to do business. It was disease, it was war, and so it was just, how can we help? How can we give development aid? There is an opinion here, there's a perspective here that is not particularly Chinese or American, it is African. Why is China in the position it is in Africa today? Why do Africans embrace this relationship with China? So the first thing is, this is a continent with significant problems, and there is space for all kinds of partners on the continent. So the idea that you close out this path to certain partners because of relationships external to the continent, for us as Africans, it makes no sense at all. What we're trying to say here is that just as there is space for the United States as a partner to its African partners, there is also space for China as a partner to Africa, and that there are definitely spheres in which China and the United States are actually competitors for power and influence. But there are also spheres in which they can be partners, and they can be collaborators, and Africa provides an opportunity for that. We see now in the West looking at Africa as a place to help with development, and China looking at Africa as a place to do business. So where the West saw an unstable place, China saw an opportunity. In the past, it was mainly China built the infrastructure, and then maybe the management company would be from Europe. There is room for everybody, every kind. I can't stress this enough, that there is room for every kind of partner on the continent. And China has a role. And I say, ask me again in 5 years if I still have the same opinion. But Chinese engagement in Africa has been a net positive.
It was 2012 when Jude traveled with Liberia's foreign minister and met then Vice President Xi Jinping in the Great Hall of the People.
Your takeaway of Xi, I have to ask that question. I mean, here you are sitting with the man who's going to be the leader of that country.
I know.
What was that like?
There was something like really, really calm about him. But then there was also the thing was he'd been properly briefed because he talked about Liberia. He talked about the difficulties that Liberia was going through and how China would be a partner to. So you came out of the meeting thinking like, this guy likes us. I mean, whether this is true or not, it's not important, right? I mean, he came into the meeting, and I think sometimes people don't fully appreciate this. This is the person who would be the next leader of China who's taken time to be briefed on Liberia and what China is going to be doing with Liberia. So when you come out of the meeting as the person who came from Liberia here to China, you walk away thinking like, there's a deeper relationship here that maybe it doesn't even exist, but that is the impression that you leave with, and so, and then we get stories about, the Liberian vice president comes to the US and then he gets patted down, by TSA, and I think at the time he may not have informed people of who he was or whatever, but look at me, I'm an aide in the president's office and I get to sit here, and then the vice president of Liberia comes through and he gets patted down, and there's pictures of it in the newspaper. These kinds of perceived slight in the face of another country that treats you like, what are these things? Sometimes some of these things, there's no substance to them. But politics is largely about perception, right? Sometimes perception trumps substance in terms of politics.
While Africa is a continent known for both political and security risks, global money is banking on Africa's growth. Foreign investment is up, China's contributions booming.
If infrastructure can make a difference, how do you envision the continent? Because I know you say this is an exciting time for the continent.
For someone who's been in that position, I had a really, really good seat a front row seat to what it's like to build a country that has been completely destroyed, bring it back up to a baseline of zero, because we were below zero, and then try to build off that baseline and what that country needs. Some of the biggest roads in the country were financed through European lending, through a trust fund, and European grants. The biggest power project in the country was through MCC from the US, $257 million, through loans with grant elements from KfW, the Germans, from NORAD, the Norwegians. I think two Chinese ambassadors will say to me over and over, we have a saying in China, if you want to build wealth, build roads. And a part of China's growth has been capital investment, investing in capital goods, like roads, like rail and stuff. And so part of what we saw, whether it was through Belt and Road or Chinese investment elsewhere in infrastructure, was basically exporting the excess capacity that China had in those places. And if there's anywhere that needed the excess capacity, it's us. There is a vision, and I showed it in my TED Talk. It's been around since the 1970s, I think. It was done by the Economic Commission for Africa, ECA. And there are 9 highways, transcontinental highways, that connect north and south, east and west. None of these highways have been completed. Some of them haven't, some portions of it haven't even been built. But the completion of that highway system will basically give Africa a transcontinental road transportation system, which means that if I grew stuff in Liberia and didn't like the prices that were being offered in Liberia, I could sell it in Ghana. I could transport it to Ghana or to Cote d'Ivoire. Kenya grows enough onions to be able to ship elsewhere in Africa, but Sierra Leone imports onions from the Netherlands because it's cheaper and easier to do that from the Netherlands, right? So there are things that are being produced next door or 2 countries over that I have to order from Europe because there's absolutely no connection between that. And if we increase trade between African countries, it means we're going to create jobs, right? Because those jobs, in terms of being created products that are being, and once we create those jobs, we're going to be able to collect taxes, and those taxes allow us to invest more in education, in health, because it's not enough to just build physical infrastructure. once that infrastructure is built, someone has to run a business that uses that infrastructure to be able to create economic value. So we also have to invest in human capital and not just physical capital. So the benefits, and that's why I think that it is an exciting time, because with the improvement in technology, the connection and connectivity we have from advances in telecommunications, this is as close as we have come to being able to deliver that. And China can be a partner in that. But the thing is, there's also room for the United States, right? There's also room for Europe in this. There's Italy signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative. New Zealand just came back from the Belt and Road Initiative and said there's space in it for them. Switzerland signed up to do financing on the Belt and Road Initiative. On what planet is an African country going to be from and be like, no, we're not going to accept it, when even in Europe, it has been accepted now? Across the Mediterranean, China is investing in European ports. And how is that not okay for them to invest in African ports? So I think there are long-standing relationships between Africa and the West, and those relationships are going to remain there for a long time.
Talk to me about tangible things that you've seen as a result of this relationship between China and the African continent, because so many people talk about it, but they don't really get into, look, this changed somebody's life because of this.
So first, I think people don't talk about it. Now, up to 40% of civil works contracts, open tenders, whether it's World Bank, African Development Bank, whoever's financing it, it's won by Chinese companies. What this has meant, it means because the Chinese companies end up being really competitive in terms of their price. And this is a domain previously dominated by European companies. And so the cost of infrastructure was very, very expensive. And I give practical reasons why. A Chinese company will mobilize with people who, they're not going to cost as much as Europeans. I mean, it's the same engineering, but they're not going to cost as much. A Chinese company will mobilize with Sinotruck, Howo. A European company will mobilize with Mercedes trucks. They're very expensive in terms of being able to do that. So African countries have actually benefited in terms of the dollar going further because of how competitive the price has been, especially for civil works in terms of infrastructure. So that's a good thing.
Women have played a substantial role in Liberian politics. Ellen Sirleaf was the first woman to lead an African country. Affectionately known as Ma Ellen, she took office at the end of a 14-year civil war.
Liberia comes first.
Working for a female president.
Yeah.
And you know, we had an election here in the United States. There still hasn't been a female president in the United States. Give me your thoughts on that.
A number of years ago, there was a cartoon in New Yorker, and there was this guy who'd come in for an interview, and then and he was asked, how do you feel about being fired by a female? Right? President Sirleaf was a different kind of leader. Up front, on the day she was inaugurated, she said she would not be an imperial president. And she opened up the space in Liberia. And this was someone who didn't seek power as a means of aggrandizing herself or accumulating wealth. She actually wanted to change the country and move the country forward. And as a graduate student, looking back at my country, it provided an excellent opportunity. So for me, it wasn't just she's the president of the country, she was also an inspiration and a mentor, right? And so today I still look to her as the kind of leader that I want to be, that at the end of my career, if I am remembered by the people I work with the way I remember her, I would have considered myself a success. So having her, she was an incredible, a wonderful boss, tough, really firm, but fair. And just look at me, but this was like 4 years ago. So I looked like an aide, like, you know, like I was somebody's assistant. But no, it was me. I was the minister of Public Works. But it wasn't just me. And at one point, there were about at least 5 of us in the cabinet who were in our mid 30s. And so this was unusual for an African country, where most of the people in power in most African countries tend to be on the older side. But even below that rank, at the level of deputy ministers and assistant ministers, they were even younger. So I thought it was an excellent opportunity, and I hope we can have more leaders on the continent who would do that.